I think it's human nature to think about other people's mindsets and motivations, and I think it's human nature to be wrong about them a lot. Welcome back to the 50/50 Project, where every week I talk through an item on a list made up of one thing I've learned for each year I've lived. This week, we're back in the conflict category for thing number 25: leave space for grace. I grew up in a big house on a big yard in a small town where everybody in my household had a lot of their own space. And so when I moved out on my own, first to a quad dorm room with three other roommates, and then onto a succession of apartments in buildings full of other apartments and other people, it was an adjustment. And over the course of all those years, and in the context of all of those living arrangements, I have developed a real fondness for that Sartre quote: hell is other people. I have that on a t-shirt. I would like that embroidered on a pillow. If I were ever to get a tattoo, it would probably be a strong contender because people are challenging, whether it's in a shared living situation or in a workplace or in a relationship. People are challenging. And that is both because of what they're doing and because of what I'm thinking about why they're doing it. When someone does something, especially something inconsiderate or inconvenient or irritating, my brain goes immediately to the whys. And the whys are typically not generous. Why is my coworker continually taking a 2-hour lunch break? It must be because he is fine with stealing an extra 5 hours of pay every week while the rest of us only take the allotted hour. Why is my neighbor blasting music at 5 a.m.? It's obviously because he's an entitled shit stain who doesn't care who he wakes up from a dead sleep as long as he gets exactly what he wants when he wants it. And before too long, these stories I'm telling myself are worse, more distressing, more frustrating, more rage making than the actual situation itself. Brene Brown, who's a social scientist who does a lot of research into human relationships and shame and vulnerability and whatnot, she talks about the stories we tell ourselves. And she actually encourages us to share the story we're writing in our heads with the people we're making over into characters in these stories. In a lecture once, she described a tense conversation she had had with her husband. They were at a party or something having a conversation, and he seemed distracted and disinterested in what she had been trying to say. And she described how, in her own head, she attributed this distance to a problem in her connection with him, describing the way her mind went from maybe he's mad at me to maybe he's embarrassed by me and doesn't want to interact right now because we're in front of other people to maybe he just flat out doesn't love me anymore. I'm forgetting the specifics, but that's sort of the general arc of her conversation in her own mind. But when she turned to her husband later and said, "Hey, you were distant with me earlier, and the story I'm telling myself is that you were avoiding me because you no longer love me." Well, then she created a space where he was able to step in and say, "Nope, I was actually really worried about something going on with our kids. And I got into a reverie when somebody else in the conversation mentioned their own children." So her point is that the stories we tell ourselves, the whys that most of us can't help but make up around any kind of social pain point, these narratives we create are often way too focused on us and much too steeped in assumptions that other people are filled to the brim with hostility or disrespect or entitlement. I think I probably do this far too often myself, and I think my life would probably be happier if I could stop constructing those oversimplified kinds of stories where I am a wronged victim in a world full of villains. So maybe that coworker does feel entitled to doing less than everybody else while being paid the same. Or maybe he routinely does a couple hours of work for the company on Saturdays and Sundays and after hours, and it all balances out. Maybe he has a 3/4 appointment that I don't know about. I don't know everything going on in his life or my workplace, so there may be an explanation that I've never heard for that kind of behavior. That neighbor blaring Imagine Dragons before the sun comes up, maybe he's just a dick. That's a possibility. Or maybe he's never lived in an apartment before and he's unaware of how easily the sound can transfer. Or maybe he's lost half his hearing recently in a fireworks accident or something and is unaware of the volume. I mean, probably not, but the point is you never really know. You just never really know what conditions and attitudes other people are working with. And it's easy to misinterpret or over embellish the scant evidence that you actually have. And I know that when I let myself write these stories around other people without ever really checking them against reality somehow, I'm probably really unfairly maligning the other guy. And I am definitely making myself more unhappy than I need to be. Because instead of just being slightly annoyed by a noise next door, I can compound that discomfort 100-fold by also hyping myself up into being offended and enraged and demoralized by the story I tell myself about the noise. A story about how entitled the neighbor playing it is, and how much they disrespect me personally as a human being, and how the whole world is on a fast track in a handbasket. And before I even know it, the outrage I feel is way, way more crazy making and happiness slaying than the music itself ever was. I remember one neighbor in particular, the worst neighbor I've ever had in my mind, who lived above me about 10 years ago now in a truly terrible complex while I was finishing up graduate school. I was living in one of those awful 1980s complexes with thin walls and shitty construction, and I could hear everything. And the last year that I lived in that place, a guy moved into the apartment above me who was the loudest person I have ever lived near. Music first thing in the morning while he got ready for work, stomping, throwing stuff, slamming doors, frequent parties attended by dozens and dozens of people who ran up and down the stairs and screamed in the shared hallway. He screamed too. He seemed to have no inside speaking voice at all, and all of his conversations were shouted. And the noise really wore me down. But so did my outrage and my sense of helplessness, because to be honest, his behavior seemed so egregious and his voice was just so loud that I could only assume he was some kind of outlaw who lived beyond even the most basic mores of a civil society. And his yelling became anger in the story I told myself about his circumstances and his character. And eventually the anger began to register as danger as I developed his character more and more without ever actually having a direct conversation with him. In fact, the only time I ever spoke to him was 2 days before I moved out of that awful apartment and went to Georgia. I was carrying boxes out to the rental van when he came stomping out through the outer door and over to his car, which was parked in the spot nearest that door. And he screamed, "Hey," at me, "Hey, you," in that very familiar tone of voice that just made me brace for conflict. And then he said something really weird, something really unexpected. He said, well, he shouted because that was just his speaking voice. He shouted, "Do you want me to move this car so you can park closer to the door? Would it help if you need to load up furniture to park here instead?" So he was offering to help, to give up his parking spot to make my move a little bit easier. He had seen that I was carrying boxes out and he had come down specifically to ask about this. And I remember standing there in kind of a shock. And half of the way down on the drive to Georgia, I kept thinking about that experience and how he had become kind of a terror for me in that apartment complex. And it really started to sink in just how much misery I had borrowed unnecessarily, that I had created for myself, and how much better I could have handled that situation If I had perhaps talked to him about the noise that was upsetting me, or even just observed him more as a human being with the potential for good and decency, than immediately maligning him as some kind of amoral, outrageous, terribly behaved enemy. Maybe he didn't realize how bad the noise was. Maybe it didn't occur to him that the people underneath you are really at your mercy in an apartment like that. I'll never know because I had made no space even for the possibility that he was a person who could accept or extend grace, much to my loss. And I say to my loss because I could have helped myself immensely by not telling and retelling and embroidering and wallowing in a story that was really upsetting and sometimes scary and infuriating. Because I wasn't really that upset about the noise. I was upset that I was being disrespected. I was upset that I was being discomfited in my own home. But those narratives were ones that I wrote by ascribing the worst possible interpretations to my main character. And I wonder just how much more bearable that time might have been for me if I had tried to tell myself a different story with a more positive frame. Maybe about a guy who was clumsy, but probably a decent person who sometimes walked loudly and didn't have enough experience to know his music was too loud. The truth is probably somewhere between, but that's not really the point. The point is that my story was harming me, not helping me. And I was closing myself off from possible solutions or solace because I had left no space for grace in how I thought about this person and the stories I told myself about him. Now, the reality is that assholes walk among us. We are surrounded by them, by people who do care mostly about themselves, by people who aren't particularly troubled by distressing others, by people who do feel entitled to do what they want to do without considering anyone around them, and worse. But although assholes are among us, I really don't think they're the majority. And most of the time, when somebody causes you to quote Sartre, maybe it's a loud neighbor or a late colleague or a driver cutting you off in the Whole Foods garage, whatever, most of the time they didn't really mean to do it, or at least they didn't mean to do it specifically to you. So, before I start telling myself a story of targeted malice and the decline of world social standards, I try to remember that most people are, at worst, just blundering around obliviously, accidentally enraging the rest of us. That doesn't fix everything. It doesn't mean I'm not annoyed or inconvenienced or boxed out of my rightful parking space at Whole Foods, but maybe it does mean that I can set that anger down instead of carrying and nursing a grievance for the next 4 or 24 or 5,000 hours, eventually weaving an increasingly dark tale of woe around it, because that helps no one. And finally, this whole thing kind of reminds me of something my dad used to say. He was essentially a very optimistic soul. He was very different from me and my sort of dark, worst case scenario personality. And he had just a ridiculous reserve of patience for people. Patience, especially for assholes, I think. And he would sometimes encourage me to give more grace to others by reminding me of how much we need it for ourselves. For every person annoying you, he often reminded me, you're probably annoying at least 4. And he applied that to himself. He applied that to everybody. It wasn't just me. But I think that's accurate in some ways. I'm not sure how he arrived specifically at those numbers, but I do think the general principle rings pretty true. And it does help me to remember as I'm working up a towering rage over some sort of slight or insult or evidence that the world is just going to hell in a handbasket, by remembering that I too have probably been a jerk 15 times on that very same day. And it does kind of help me to reroute sometimes. Okay, I think that's about enough of this for now. I hope you find grace in all of your spaces today. Thanks for spending some time with me. And thanks especially to those of you who've been here from the beginning, as this is episode 25, and we are somehow already halfway through this entire big, weird project. I'll be back next week with thing number 26.